Hello, everyone. Before we dive in, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. I'll never forget the night we pulled her out of the water. I was 19 at the time, working on a fishing trawler with my Uncle Ray. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. We'd head out to sea for a week or two at a time, hauling in nets heavy with fish before returning to port to sell our catch. It was grueling, smelly, and sometimes dangerous, but I liked the quiet of the open ocean. That night, we were about 50 miles off the coast. The air was cold, the sea calm, and the stars were shining so brightly it felt like you could reach up and grab one. There were 5 of us on the boat: me, Uncle Ray, and 3 other deckhands: Mike, Charlie, and Liam. We just finished hauling in a big catch, our nets bulging with fish, when we heard it. A sound I'll never forget. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the engine. A soft, melodic humming, like a lullaby carried on the wind. "Do you hear that?" I asked, looking at Uncle Ray. He frowned, turning off the engine so the boat drifted in silence. The humming grew louder, clearer. It wasn't just a sound, it was a voice. "It's a woman," Charlie said, leaning over the side of the boat, his eyes scanning the dark water. "No woman in her right mind would be out here," Uncle Ray muttered, but I could see the unease in his face. The voice grew louder, more insistent, as if calling to us. "We need to see what that is," Liam said, grabbing a flashlight. "Leave it," Uncle Ray snapped. "We're not out here to chase ghosts." But it was too late. The voice had a strange pull to it, like it was wrapping around us and tugging us toward the edge of the boat. That's when we saw her. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on something floating in the water. It was a woman. She was barely moving, her pale skin shimmering like moonlight on the waves. Long, dark hair clung to her face, and her eyes were closed, as if she were asleep. "Holy crap," Mike said, running to grab a life preserver. "Don't," Uncle Ray barked, grabbing his arm. "We don't know what that is." "She's drowning," Charlie shouted, already lowering the net into the water to scoop her up. Uncle Ray cursed under his breath, but he didn't stop him. We hauled her aboard, her limp body flopping onto the deck like a dead fish. She was completely naked, her skin ice-cold and slick with seawater. Her lips were blue, and her chest barely moved as she breathed. "She's alive," Liam said, kneeling beside her. "But just barely." "Get her a blanket," I said, grabbing a tarp from the storage bin and throwing it over her. Uncle Ray stood back, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "This is a mistake," he muttered. "A big mistake." "She's human," I snapped. "She needs help." But even as I said it, I felt a strange unease settle in my chest. There was something wrong about her. She woke up an hour later. Her eyes fluttered open, and I gasped. They weren't normal eyes. They were too big, too bright, with irises the color of the sea, shifting between blue and green with every blink. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice soft and musical. "You're on a fishing boat," I said, kneeling beside her. "We found you in the water." Her gaze darted around the deck, her body trembling beneath the tarp. "Thank you," she said, her lips curling into a weak smile. "Do you remember what happened?" Liam asked. She shook her head. "The water," she murmured. "It pulled me under." Her voice sent a shiver down my spine. It was beautiful, almost hypnotic, but there was something unsettling about it. As the night went on, strange things started happening. The fish we'd caught earlier began thrashing in their nets, as if they were trying to escape. The boat creaked and groaned, rocking on waves that hadn't been there before. "She's bad luck," Uncle Ray said, glaring at her. "We need to throw her back." "She's not a fish," I said, my voice rising. "She's a person." He grabbed my arm, his face inches from mine. "You don't know what she is," he hissed. "You don't know what you've brought aboard." I pulled away, but his words stuck with me. The woman barely spoke, but every now and then, I'd catch her watching me. Her eyes were too bright, too piercing, and they seemed to look right through me. "Do you have a name?" I asked her once, trying to break the silence. She smiled faintly. "Call me Mara," she said. "Mara," I repeated. "That's a beautiful name." She tilted her head, her smile widening. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft and sweet. But there was something in her smile that made my stomach twist. By the second night, the crew was on edge. The fish were all dead, their bodies bloated and reeking in the nets. The waves had grown larger, slamming against the sides of the boat and sending sprays of salt water over the deck. And Mara, she changed. Her skin was paler now, almost translucent, and her hair clung to her face like seaweed. Her movements were slow and jerky, like she wasn't used to her own body. "We need to get rid of her," Uncle Ray said, grabbing a harpoon from the storage rack. "You can't be serious," I said, stepping between him and Mara. "She's killing us," he snapped. "The fish are dead. The boat's falling apart. She's not human." Mara looked up at me, her bright eyes filled with fear. "Please," she whispered, "don't let him hurt me." Her voice wrapped around me like a warm blanket, and for a moment, I forgot about everything else. "She stays," I said, my voice firm. Uncle Ray cursed under his breath, but he didn't argue. That night, everything went to hell. It started with the storm. The waves grew higher and higher, crashing over the deck and threatening to tip the boat. The wind howled like a living thing, and the rain came down in sheets, blinding us. And through it all, I could hear her voice. Mara was singing. It was a haunting, otherworldly melody that cut through the roar of the storm like a knife. "What the hell is she doing?" Mike shouted, clutching the railing as the boat rocked violently. "She's calling them," Uncle Ray said, his voice filled with terror. "Calling who?" I shouted, but I already knew the answer. Shapes began to emerge from the water. At first, I thought they were dolphins, their sleek bodies cutting through the waves. But as they got closer, I saw the truth. They were like Mara, pale, human-like faces with bright, piercing eyes, long, sinewy bodies that shimmered like fish scales, sharp, jagged teeth that glinted in the lightning. They surrounded the boat, their hands clawing at the sides, their eyes locked onto us with hunger. "Mara, stop!" I shouted, grabbing her arm, but she didn't stop. She turned to me, her smile wide and unnatural, and I saw the truth. She wasn't human. She never had been. The last thing I remember is the sound of wood splintering as the boat capsized. When I woke up, I was floating on a piece of debris, the sun rising over the calm sea. The boat was gone. The crew was gone. And Mara was gone. To this day, I don't know why she spared me, but sometimes when I'm lying in bed, I hear her voice in my dreams, and I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for me to come back. People in the village used to whisper that the sea could take more than it gave. I'd always laughed at those stories. I'd grown up by the ocean, spending every summer helping my dad on his fishing boat. It was my home, my life. The idea that the sea was something to fear had always seemed ridiculous to me. Until it took my husband. Not all at once. No, that would have been easier. The ocean didn't drown him. It didn't pull him under or smash him against the rocks. It changed him. It started the night he came back from his last trip. James was a fisherman, just like my father had been, and we'd lived our whole marriage in the little house on the hill overlooking the harbor. He'd been gone for 4 days, out with the rest of the crew on one of the larger trawlers. The weather had been rough, and I'd spent most of that time worrying, as I always did. When I saw him walk up the dock that evening, I felt a wave of relief so strong it brought tears to my eyes. But as he got closer, I realized something was wrong. James was quiet that night. Normally, he'd come home with stories about the trip, what they'd caught, who'd gotten seasick, which of the crew had argued over the nets. But that night, he barely spoke. He sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the dark sea, his hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea. "Everything okay?" I asked, setting a plate of stew in front of him. He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "We saw something." "What do you mean?" His fingers tightened around the mug. "Out on the water," he said, "there was a woman." "A woman?" I frowned. "On another boat?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "In the water." He wouldn't say much more, no matter how much I pressed him. "We were pulling up the nets," he said finally, "and she was just there, floating in the waves." "What happened to her?" I asked, my chest tightening. "She swam away," he said, his voice hollow. I stared at him, waiting for more, but that was all he'd say. Eventually, he went to bed, leaving his dinner untouched. That night, I woke to the sound of the front door creaking open. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but when I turned over, James's side of the bed was empty. I got up, wrapping a robe around myself, and went downstairs. The door was wide open, and the cold sea air rushed in, making me shiver. "James!" I called out, stepping outside. The village was quiet, the moon casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets. I spotted him down by the harbor, standing at the edge of the dock, staring out at the water. "James, what are you doing?" I called, hurrying down to him. He didn't answer. When I got closer, I saw his face. His eyes were wide and glassy, his lips slightly parted, as if he were in a trance. "James," I said, grabbing his arm. He blinked, his expression snapping back to normal. I couldn't sleep," he said, rubbing his face. "I just needed some air." But I didn't believe him. The next few days were worse. James barely ate, barely spoke. He spent most of his time down by the harbor, staring out at the water. "You're going to get sick," I said one afternoon, standing behind him as he sat on a crate by the dock. He didn't respond. "You haven't eaten all day," I said, my voice sharper now. "I'm not hungry," he muttered. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "What's going on with you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Is this about the woman you saw? Was she someone you knew?" He turned to look at me then, and the expression on his face sent a shiver down my spine. "No," he said softly, "but I think she knows me." That night, I woke to the sound of water dripping. At first, I thought it was the kitchen sink, But when I went downstairs, the faucet was off. The sound was coming from outside. I opened the door and froze. James was standing in the yard, soaking wet, his clothes clinging to his body and water dripping from his hair. "James!" I ran to him, grabbing his arm. "What the hell are you doing?" He turned to look at me, his eyes wide and empty. "She's calling me," he whispered. "Who?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The woman in the water," he said. The next morning, I went to talk to one of the other fishermen, an older man named Bill who'd known James for years. "He's not himself," I said, sitting across from him at the little cafe near the harbor. "He won't eat. He won't sleep. He keeps talking about some woman he saw on the trip." Bill's face went pale. "You mean the woman in the water?" he asked. I nodded. "I've heard stories about her," he said, lowering his voice. "A siren, a sea witch, whatever you want to call her. She's bad news. They say she lures men out to sea and takes them under." "That's ridiculous," I said, though my hands were trembling. "Keep an eye on him," Bill said, his voice grim. "Once she's got her hooks in him, she won't let go." That night, James disappeared. I woke up to find his side of the bed empty, his boots gone from the doorway. I ran down to the harbor, my heart pounding, and found his fishing boat missing. "James!" I shouted, my voice echoing over the empty docks. There was no answer. It was 3 days before they found him. The Coast Guard spotted the boat drifting miles off the coast, the deck empty except for a tangle of nets and a single shoe. James's body washed up a week later, bloated and pale, his skin covered in strange, dark marks that the coroner couldn't explain. To this day, I don't know what really happened to him, but sometimes when I stand by the harbor at night, I hear a faint voice calling from the waves, and I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for someone else to answer her call. They told us the reef was the safest place to swim. The island was beautiful, a picture-perfect tropical paradise with white sandy beaches, swaying palm trees, and turquoise water that sparkled like diamonds in the sunlight. It was the kind of place you'd see on the cover of a travel magazine, a place that felt like it couldn't possibly have any dangers lurking beneath its surface. At least, that's what they told us. It wasn't until the end of the trip that I realized how wrong they were. I'd never been snorkeling before. My fiancé, Evan, had signed us up for the reef tour as part of our vacation package. He was the adventurous one, always looking for the next thrill, while I preferred to stay on the shore, soaking up the sun with a drink in my hand. "It's totally safe," he said as we stood on the dock, waiting for the boat to take us out. "The guide said the reef is shallow, and there's no big fish out there." "I don't care about big fish," I muttered, adjusting my snorkel mask. "It's the little ones I'm worried about." He laughed, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "You'll be fine. It's just fish. What are they gonna do? Tickle you to death?" I forced a smile, but the uneasy feeling in my stomach didn't go away. The boat ride out to the reef was smooth, the water calm and clear. There were about 10 of us on the tour, a mix of couples, families, and solo travelers. Our guide, a cheerful woman named Jenna, stood at the front of the boat, pointing out different landmarks and telling us about the reef. "The coral here is over 1,000 years old," she said, her voice loud and enthusiastic. "And it's home to hundreds of species of fish, sea turtles, and even dolphins. Just remember, don't touch anything. The coral is fragile, and some of the fish can sting. See? Evan whispered, nudging me. Nothing to worry about. I nodded, trying to ignore the twisting feeling in my gut. When we arrived at the reef, the boat anchored in a shallow area where the water was only about 10 feet deep. The first thing I noticed was how clear the water was. I could see straight to the bottom, where vibrant coral formations created a maze of tunnels and caves. Schools of colorful fish darted between the coral, their scales shimmering in the sunlight. It's beautiful, I admitted as Evan helped me adjust my snorkel. Ready to go in? He asked, grinning. Yeah, I said, though my heart was pounding. The water was warm and salty, wrapping around me like a second skin as I floated on the surface. I followed Evan as he swam toward the reef, the sound of my breathing echoing in my ears through the snorkel. At first, it was incredible. The coral was even more vibrant up close, and the fish swam so close I could almost touch them. I felt like I was in another world, far away from the stress of work and the noise of the city. But then I saw it, something dark, moving in the distance. It was just a shadow at first, barely visible through the shimmering water. I stopped swimming, treading water as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The shadow was long and thin, moving slowly along the edge of the reef. At first, I thought it was a shark, but it didn't move like one. Its movements were too smooth, too graceful, like it was gliding through the water. I reached out and grabbed Evan's arm, pulling him back toward me. What? He said, his voice muffled through his snorkel. I pointed toward the shadow. He squinted, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the distance. It's probably a dolphin, he said, shrugging. Nothing to worry about. But as the shadow moved closer, I realized it wasn't a dolphin. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. The thing in the water was long and sinewy, with a body that shimmered like fish scales. Its head was human-like, with long, dark hair that floated around it like seaweed. It turned toward us, and I felt my stomach drop. Its eyes were too large, too bright, and they locked onto mine with an intensity that made my blood run cold. Evan, I said, my voice trembling. What? He asked, following my gaze. When he saw it, he froze. What the hell is that? He whispered. The thing tilted its head, its dark eyes narrowing as it swam closer. Let's go back to the boat, I said, grabbing his hand. But before we could move, it disappeared. We swam back toward the boat as fast as we could, my heart pounding in my chest. Did you see that thing? Evan asked as we climbed aboard, pulling off his snorkel. Yeah, I said, my hands shaking. What was it? He shook his head, his face pale. I don't know. For the rest of the tour, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every time I looked into the water, I thought I saw it. A flash of movement, a glimmer of scales, but it was always gone before I could be sure. By the time we got back to the resort, I was a nervous wreck. I think we should tell someone, I said as we sat on the balcony of our room, watching the sunset. Tell them what? Evan said, that we saw a fish with a weird face. It wasn't a fish, I said, my voice trembling. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, it's probably nothing. Let's just forget about it and enjoy the rest of the trip. But I couldn't forget. That night, I woke to the sound of water dripping. At first, I thought it was just the faucet in the bathroom, but when I got up to check, the sink was dry. The sound was coming from the balcony. I stepped outside, the cool night air making me shiver, and froze. There was a puddle of water on the floor, and wet footprints leading toward the edge of the balcony. "Evan?" I whispered, turning toward the bed, but he wasn't there. I ran down to the beach, my heart pounding in my chest. "Evan," I shouted, my voice echoing over the empty sand. The only answer was the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. I waded into the water, the cold surf lapping at my legs. That's when I saw it. A figure, just beneath the surface, its bright eyes staring up at me. It smiled, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth, and in its arms, it held Evan. They never found his body. The resort staff said he must have gone swimming alone at night and drowned. But I know the truth. I know what I saw. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that thing's face. The glimmer of its scales, the sharpness of its teeth, the hunger in its eyes. And I know it's still out there, waiting for someone else to take its place beneath the reef. I always hated the idea of being stranded on the ocean. Don't get me wrong. I loved vacations and tropical beaches, but something about being surrounded by miles of water, with no land in sight, made me feel uneasy. Still, when my best friend Amy begged me to come on a cruise with her, I let her talk me into it. "It'll be fun," she'd said, practically bouncing with excitement. Drinks, pools, shows, a whole week of just relaxing. She wasn't wrong. The cruise ship was massive, practically a floating city, with restaurants, theaters, and even a water park on board. For the first 2 days, I almost forgot we were even on the water. Almost. But that unease never fully left me. It started with the dreams. On the third night of the cruise, I woke up in a cold sweat. In the dream, I'd been standing on the edge of the ship, staring down into the dark water below. At first, it had been calm, the surface still and smooth like black glass. But then something had emerged from the depths, a pale, human-like face with wide, piercing eyes. It had smiled at me, its sharp teeth glinting in the moonlight, and started to sing. The sound was soft and sweet, a haunting melody that made my chest tighten. And then I'd woken up. I sat up in bed, trying to shake the image from my mind. "It was just a dream," I whispered to myself, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I told Amy about the dream as we ate breakfast on the deck. "Creepy," she said, popping a piece of pineapple into her mouth. "But it's just your brain messing with you. You've been tense about this trip since we got on the boat." "Maybe," I said, though the unease in my chest didn't go away. As we sipped our coffee, I glanced out at the water. The sun was shining, and the waves sparkled like diamonds, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That afternoon, Amy wanted to go to the pool, but I wasn't feeling up for it. "Suit yourself," she said, grabbing her towel. "Don't stay cooped up in here all day, though. You'll go crazy." "I won't," I promised, forcing a smile. After she left, I wandered around the ship, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. I ended up on one of the lower decks, where the crowds were thinner and the sound of the ocean was louder. I leaned against the railing, staring out at the endless stretch of water. That's when I heard it, a soft, melodic humming coming from somewhere below. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was faint, almost drowned out by the crash of the waves. But it was there, a haunting, otherworldly melody that sent a chill down my spine. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The humming stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, I saw something move just beneath the surface of the water. It was fast, too fast for me to make out any details, but it was there, a dark shape darting through the waves. I stumbled back from the railing, my chest tightening with fear. That night, the dream came back. This time, it was more vivid. I was standing on the edge of the ship again, staring down into the water, but this time, I wasn't alone. Amy was standing next to me, her face pale and her eyes wide. "Do you hear it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Hear what?" I asked. "The singing," she said, pointing toward the water. I looked down and saw it again. The face, pale and haunting, its wide eyes locking onto mine. The singing grew louder, more insistent, wrapping around me like a physical force. "Come closer," the voice whispered, soft and sweet. "Come closer." I woke up gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. The next morning, Amy was acting strange. She barely spoke during breakfast, her face pale and her hands trembling. "You okay?" I asked, frowning. She nodded, but I could tell she was lying. "Did you have a bad dream or something?" I asked. Her head snapped up, and for a moment, I saw something in her eyes. Something dark, something afraid. I don't want to talk about it," she muttered, standing up and walking away. That afternoon, Amy disappeared. We'd been sitting by the pool when she suddenly got up and said she needed some air. "I'll be back in a bit," she said, forcing a smile. But she never came back. I searched the entire ship, my chest tightening with panic, but there was no sign of her. By the time the sun set, I was frantic. She wouldn't just disappear. I told the crew member at the reception desk, "Something's happened to her." "We'll conduct a thorough search," the man said, his tone calm and professional. "In the meantime, please try to stay calm." But I couldn't stay calm. Something was wrong. I knew it. That night, I woke to the sound of humming. It was coming from the balcony. I got out of bed, my hands shaking, and pulled back the curtain. Amy was standing on the edge of the railing, her back to me, her long hair blowing in the wind. "Amy!" I shouted, running toward her. She didn't turn around. "Amy, what are you doing?" I grabbed her arm, pulling her back from the edge. She turned to look at me, and my stomach dropped. Her eyes were empty. No irises, no pupils, just dark, empty sockets that stared through me. "They're calling me," she whispered, her voice distorted. And then, she jumped. The crew said it was an accident. A tragic fall, they called it, though they couldn't explain why she'd been on the balcony in the middle of the night. But I knew the truth. I knew what I'd seen. I spent the rest of the trip locked in my room, too afraid to go near the water. Even now, weeks later, I still hear the singing in my dreams. And I wonder if Amy's still out there, somewhere beneath the waves, waiting for someone else to hear the call. We didn't know the lake was cursed when we chose the campsite. There were 6 of us, me, my boyfriend Ryan, my best friend Taylor, her little brother Ben, and 2 other friends, Sarah and Liam. We'd been planning the trip for months, a chance to get away from the stress of college and spend a long weekend in the middle of nowhere. The lake was beautiful, surrounded by tall trees and shrouded in mist. It was so remote that there wasn't another soul in sight. No cabins, no other campers, just us in the quiet wilderness. Looking back, that should have been the first warning sign. The first day was perfect. We pitched our tents in a clearing near the water and spent the afternoon swimming and fishing. The lake was cool and clear, and I could see all the way to the bottom, where smooth stones and patches of seaweed swayed gently in the current. "This place is amazing," Taylor said, floating on her back. "I know, right?" Ryan said, grinning as he splashed her. I sat on the shore, letting the sun warm my skin, and watched as the others laughed and played in the water. For the first time in months, I felt completely relaxed. But that night, everything changed. It started with the singing. I woke up sometime after midnight, the moonlight filtering through the trees and casting strange shadows on the walls of the tent. At first, I thought the sound was just the wind whistling through the trees. But as I lay there, I realized it wasn't the wind. It was a voice, soft and melodic, humming a haunting tune that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Ryan," I whispered, nudging him awake. He muttered, half asleep. "Do you hear that?" He frowned, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" I held my breath, listening. The voice was gone. "Never mind," I said, lying back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The next morning, I told the others about the voice. "It was probably just an animal," Sarah said, brushing her hair back. "Or maybe the wind." "I don't know," I said, staring out at the lake. It sounded human. "Well, there's no one out here but us," Liam said, cracking open a soda, "so I wouldn't worry about it." Ryan put his arm around me, kissing my temple. "See? Nothing to worry about. Let's just enjoy the trip." I nodded, forcing a smile, but deep down, I couldn't shake the unease in my chest. That afternoon, we decided to take the canoe out onto the lake. It was an old, battered thing we'd found near the shore, probably left behind by someone who'd camped there years ago. It leaked a little, but not enough to be a problem. Ryan and I climbed in first, paddling out to the middle of the lake while the others stayed on the shore. The water was so still it looked like glass, and the only sounds were the rhythmic splash of the paddles and the occasional call of a bird in the distance. "This is nice," Ryan said, smiling at me. "Yeah," I said, though my eyes kept drifting to the water. Something about it seemed off. We were about 50 feet from the shore when I saw it. A dark shape, just beneath the surface, moving slowly toward the canoe. "Ryan," I said, my voice trembling. "What?" "There's something in the water." He frowned, looking over the side. "It's probably just a fish." But it wasn't a fish. The shape was too big, too long, and it moved with a strange, serpentine grace. I grabbed his arm, my chest tightening. "We need to go back." All right, he said, turning the canoe around. But as we paddled back toward the shore, I felt something brush against the bottom of the canoe, something long and slimy. When we got back to shore, I told the others what I'd seen. "You're probably just imagining things," Liam said, laughing. "I'm not," I said, my voice shaking. "There's something in the lake." "It's probably just a log," Sarah said, rolling her eyes. "Or a big fish," Taylor added. But I knew it wasn't a log or a fish. There was something in that lake, and it was watching us. That night, the singing came back. This time, it was louder, clearer, and it was coming from the lake. I sat up in the tent, my heart pounding, and listened. The voice was soft and sweet, singing a haunting melody that seemed to wrap around me like a warm blanket. I got up, slipping on my jacket, and unzipped the tent. The others were standing by the water's edge, their faces pale in the moonlight. "Do you hear that?" Taylor whispered. We all nodded, too afraid to speak. The singing grew louder, more insistent, and I found myself taking a step closer to the water. "No," Ryan said, grabbing my arm. "Don't." But it was too late. The surface of the lake rippled, and a figure emerged from the water. She was beautiful. Her skin was pale and shimmering, her long hair floating around her like a dark halo. Her eyes were wide and bright, and her lips curled into a soft, inviting smile. Who are you?" Taylor whispered, her voice trembling. The woman tilted her head, her smile widening. "Come closer," she said, her voice like a song. None of us moved. Her smile faded, and her eyes darkened. "Come closer," she said again, her voice sharp and commanding. Liam took a step forward, his face slack and his eyes glazed over. "Liam, no," Sarah shouted, grabbing his arm. But he didn't stop. He walked into the water, the surface closing over his head as the woman reached out to pull him under. The next morning, we searched the lake, but there was no sign of Liam. The canoe was gone, and the water was still and silent, as if nothing had happened. "We need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. The others nodded, their faces pale and filled with fear. But as we packed up our things, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We never told anyone what happened. The official story was that Liam drowned while swimming, a tragic accident. But I know the truth. I know what we saw. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear her singing, calling me back to the lake. I should have left the village when I had the chance. It was supposed to be a quick trip, a week at most. The university had sent me to study an unusual phenomenon that had been reported in the area: strange lights in the water at night. I'd read the locals' reports before coming. They described glowing orbs of light that appeared just beneath the surface of the ocean, moving in strange patterns. Some said they were beautiful, mesmerizing, while others claimed they were unsettling. "It's probably bioluminescent algae," I told my colleague before I left. "Or maybe a species of deep-sea fish we haven't documented yet." I was wrong. It wasn't algae, and it wasn't fish. The village was small, tucked away on a rocky coastline where the cliffs jutted out into the sea. The kind of place that felt like it hadn't changed in 100 years. When I arrived, the locals were friendly enough, but there was an underlying tension in the air. People spoke in hushed tones, glancing nervously at the ocean as if it might rise up and swallow them whole. "The lights started about a month ago," an old fisherman told me as he smoked his pipe on the dock. "At first, we thought it was just the tide stirring up the algae. But then people started hearing things." "Hearing things?" I asked, jotting down notes in my journal. "Voices," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Singing, coming from the water, calling to us." I tried to hide my skepticism. "And did anyone follow the singing?" He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. That night, I went down to the shore with my equipment. The wind was cold, and the waves crashed against the rocks, sending sprays of salt water into the air. I set up my camera and audio recorder, focusing on a quiet cove where the lights had been reported. For hours, I sat there, watching and waiting. The ocean was dark and empty, the only sound the rhythmic roar of the waves. And then I saw them. At first, it was just a faint glow, barely visible beneath the surface of the water. I leaned forward, my heart racing as the light grew brighter, splitting into several smaller orbs that danced and swirled like fireflies. Bioluminescence, I whispered to myself, fumbling for my camera. But as I started filming, I realized something was wrong. The lights weren't random. They were moving in deliberate patterns, circling each other in a way that seemed almost intentional. And then I heard it, a soft, melodic humming, drifting up from the water. I froze, my chest tightening. It wasn't just noise. It was a voice. I stood there, rooted to the spot, as the humming grew louder, more insistent. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The lights stopped moving. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, a figure emerged from the water. She was beautiful. Her skin shimmered in the moonlight, her long, dark hair clinging to her shoulders. Her eyes were wide and piercing, reflecting the glow of the lights beneath her. "Who are you?" I whispered, my throat dry. She didn't answer. She just smiled, her lips curling into a soft, inviting grin. The humming grew louder, wrapping around me like a warm embrace. "Come closer," she said, her voice sweet and melodic. I took a step forward, my feet sinking into the wet sand. "Come closer," she said again, her eyes locking onto mine. Something in the back of my mind screamed at me to stop, but I couldn't. Her voice was like a magnet, pulling me toward her. I was ankle deep in the water when I snapped out of it. "No," I said, stumbling back. Her smile faded, and her eyes darkened. "Come closer," she said, her voice sharper now. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. Behind me, I heard a splash, followed by a low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. By the time I reached my car, I was shaking so badly I could barely hold the keys. The next morning, I told the village elder what had happened. "You saw her," he said, his face pale. "Who?" I asked. "The drowning woman," he said. "She's been here for centuries. Some say she was cursed, others say she's a spirit of the sea. But one thing's for sure, she's not human." "And the lights?" I asked, my voice trembling. "They're how she lures you in," he said. "Once you're close enough, she drags you under." I wanted to leave the village right then and there, but I couldn't stop thinking about the lights, about her. That night, I went back to the cove. This time, I stayed farther back, watching from the safety of the cliffs. The lights appeared again, brighter than before, swirling and dancing just below the surface. And then she emerged. Her face was turned toward the ocean, her hair blowing in the wind. "Who are you?" I whispered, though I knew she couldn't hear me. She turned, her piercing eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, I thought I saw sadness in her expression. Then she smiled, and the humming began again. I left the village the next morning. I told myself I'd done all I could, that the phenomenon was beyond my understanding. But the truth is, I was scared. I still dream about her sometimes. Her face, her voice, the way she looked at me as if she knew me. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the humming again. And I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for me to come back. I was desperate for a job when I took the night shift at the aquarium. It wasn't exactly what I wanted to be doing, but money was tight, and I couldn't afford to be picky. The place was small, run down, and felt more like a relic of the past than an actual tourist attraction. Most of the tanks were cracked or cloudy, and the fish inside looked as tired as the building itself. Not much to it, my manager, Greg, had said during my first shift. Just make sure no one breaks in, check the tanks every couple of hours, and lock up before you leave. Easy. Easy. That's what I'd told myself every night as I made my rounds. But by my third week, I knew there was something wrong with this place, especially with the tank in the back. They called it the Mermaid tank. It was the largest exhibit in the aquarium, a massive cylinder that stretched from the floor to the ceiling. But it was empty now, nothing but murky water and a few scattered rocks at the bottom. The glass was covered in smudges and scratches, and the plaque beneath it had been worn down by time. I could barely make out the words. Mermaid Lagoon Exhibit, opened 1987, closed 2003. When I asked Greg about it, he just shrugged. They used to do some kind of mermaid show here, back in the day. Women in costumes swimming around for the kids. But one of them drowned, and the exhibit's been shut down ever since. The way he said it, so casual, like it didn't even matter, sent a chill down my spine. The first time I noticed something strange was during my second week. It was around 2 a.m., and I was doing my usual rounds, checking the tanks and making sure everything was locked up. The building was silent, except for the hum of the filtration systems and the occasional creak of the old pipes. When I passed the Mermaid tank, I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from inside the glass. I stopped, my heart skipping a beat, and listened. The tapping came again, louder this time, like someone knocking on a door. I stepped closer, my flashlight beam cutting through the murky water. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, something moved in the water. It was quick, just a flicker of motion at the edge of the flashlight beam. But I saw it, a shadow, long and sinuous, darting behind one of the rocks. I stumbled back, my chest tightening. "Hello?" I called out again, though I wasn't sure what I was expecting. The water was still now, as murky and lifeless as it had been before. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the stress of working nights was starting to get to me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next night, it happened again. I was walking past the tank when I heard the tapping. This time, it was faster, more insistent, like whoever, or whatever, was inside wanted my attention. I hesitated, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and shone it into the tank. The water rippled, and a face appeared. It was a woman. At least, I thought it was at first. Her skin was pale and slick, her dark hair floating around her like seaweed. Her eyes were wide and bright, reflecting the beam of the flashlight like a cat's. She pressed her hands against the glass, her fingers long and webbed, and tilted her head, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. For a moment, I was frozen, unable to look away from her piercing gaze. Then she smiled. Her lips parted, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that made my blood run cold. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, and the face disappeared. The water was still again, the faint tapping replaced by the hum of the filtration system. I told Greg about it the next day, but he just laughed. "Must have been a reflection," he said, shaking his head. Or maybe you were just seeing things. That tank's been empty for years." I wanted to argue, but I could see it in his eyes. He didn't believe me. No one would. Over the next few nights, the tapping got louder. It wasn't just at the Mermaid tank anymore. I'd hear it in the hallway, by the other exhibits, even in the break room. Sometimes, I thought I heard humming, soft and melodic, drifting through the building. And every time I passed the Mermaid tank, I felt her watching me. It all came to a head on my last night. I was making my rounds as usual, my chest tight with unease. The tapping had been louder than ever, echoing through the empty halls like a drumbeat. When I reached the Mermaid tank, I stopped. The water was clear now, so clear I could see all the way to the bottom. And she was there. She floated just beneath the surface, her hair fanned out around her and her wide, unblinking eyes locked onto mine. "Let me out," she whispered, her voice muffled by the glass. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "What?" I whispered. "Let me out," she said again, pressing her hands against the glass. The water began to churn, swirling around her in violent currents. "Please," she said, her voice soft and sweet. For a moment, I almost believed her. Then she smiled, and I saw the hunger in her eyes. The glass cracked. A thin line snaked its way down the side of the tank, water seeping through and pooling on the floor. "Let me out," she said one last time, her voice echoing in my head. I ran. By the time I reached the exit, the sound of shattering glass filled the building. I didn't stop, didn't look back. When Greg called me the next day, I didn't answer. I never went back to the aquarium. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the tapping again, and I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for someone else to let her out. If I hadn't pulled her from the water that day, none of this would have happened. It was 20 years ago, during the worst storm I'd ever seen. The waves were so high they swallowed the horizon, and the wind howled like a living thing. I'd gone out to secure my boat, afraid the storm would tear it from the dock when I saw her. She was floating face down in the water, her long black hair fanning out around her like seaweed. For a moment, I thought she was dead, but when I pulled her onto the dock, she coughed and opened her eyes. They were the most beautiful eyes I'd ever seen, bright green, like sunlight shining through the trees. She didn't say anything, just stared at me, shivering in the cold. "Where did you come from?" I asked, but she didn't answer. There were no other boats nearby, no sign of a wreck. It was like she'd appeared out of nowhere. I brought her back to my house and wrapped her in a blanket, trying to warm her up. "What's your name?" I asked. She looked at me with those bright green eyes and whispered, "Mara." That was all she'd say. No last name, no explanation of how she'd ended up in the water. I should have gone to the authorities, but I didn't. There was something about her, something I couldn't explain, that made me want to keep her close. So I let her stay. We were married a year later. The villagers whispered about her, of course. How could they not? She was beautiful, almost unnaturally so, with skin as pale as moonlight and a voice that could make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. "She's too good for him," I heard one of them say once. There's something not right about her. But I didn't care what they thought. I loved her. At least, I thought I did. At first, everything was perfect. Mara never spoke about her past, but I didn't press her. She seemed happy, and that was enough for me. But over time, I started to notice things. Little things, at first. She never ate fish, even when it was all we had. She hated going near the ocean, refusing to step foot on the beach or the docks. And sometimes, at night, I'd wake up to find her standing at the window, staring out at the water with a look I couldn't quite understand. "Are you okay?" I'd ask, wrapping my arms around her. She'd always smile and say, "I'm fine," but I knew she wasn't. The first real sign that something was wrong happened about 5 years into our marriage. I'd gone out early one morning to check the nets and found them empty. That wasn't unusual. Fishing could be unpredictable. But when I hauled them in, I noticed something strange. The ropes were frayed, as if something had been chewing on them, and the water around the boat was tinged red with blood. "Sharks," one of the other fishermen said, shaking his head. "They've been coming closer to shore lately, but it didn't look like sharks to me." The bite marks on the nets were too small, too clean. When I got home, Mara was waiting for me. "Rough day?" she asked, her voice soft. I nodded, dropping the empty nets onto the ground. "You should stay away from the water," she said, her green eyes locking onto mine. There was something in her voice, something sharp, almost commanding, that made my chest tighten. That night, I had the first dream. I was standing on the edge of the dock, staring out at the ocean, when I saw something move beneath the surface. At first, I thought it was a school of fish, their silver scales catching the moonlight. But as they came closer, I realized they weren't fish. They were faces, dozens of pale, human-like faces with wide, empty eyes and mouths filled with sharp teeth. They were staring at me, their hands reaching up toward the surface. I woke up gasping for air, my chest slick with sweat. Mara was sitting up beside me, her green eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice calm. "Just a bad dream," I said, trying to catch my breath. She reached out and touched my face, her fingers cold as ice. "It's nothing," she said, her lips curling into a soft smile. "Go back to sleep." But I couldn't. The dreams kept coming, each one worse than the last. I dreamed of drowning, of being pulled into the depths by pale hands. I dreamed of Mara standing on the shore, watching as the waves dragged me under. During the day, things were no better. The fish stopped biting, the other fishermen started avoiding me, and the villagers began whispering behind my back. "It's her," one of them said, loud enough for me to hear. "She's cursed." I didn't want to believe it, but the signs were impossible to ignore. One night, I woke to the sound of humming. At first, I thought it was part of the dream, but when I opened my eyes, Mara wasn't in bed. I got up, my heart pounding, and followed the sound to the shore. She was standing in the water, her long black hair floating around her and her green eyes glowing like lanterns. "Mara?" I called out, my voice trembling. She turned to look at me, and my stomach dropped. Her face was different, sharper, more angular, and her teeth gleamed in the moonlight like a row of knives. "Come to me," she said, her voice soft and melodic. I stumbled back, my chest tightening with fear. "What are you?" I whispered. Her smile faded, and for a moment, I thought I saw sadness in her eyes. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said, "but you shouldn't have saved me." The water around her began to churn, and I saw them. Dozens of pale faces, their empty eyes staring up at me from the depths. "Come with me," Mara said, her voice wrapping around me like a warm blanket. I ran. I left the village the next morning. I don't know what happened to Mara or to the others. I didn't stay to find out, but sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I hear her voice in my dreams, and I wonder if she's still waiting for me to come back. I thought the Arctic would be the perfect place to start over. I'd been running from my old life, bad decisions, failed relationships, and an endless pile of debt. And when I saw the job posting for a research assistant at an Arctic marine station, it felt like a sign. No distractions, I told myself as the plane descended toward the frozen landscape. Just work and peace. But I was wrong. The Arctic wasn't peaceful. It was alive, and it was hiding something. The station was small, just a handful of buildings clustered on the edge of the ice shelf, overlooking the frozen sea. There were 5 of us working there: Dr. Hansen, the lead researcher; Marina, a tech specialist; Luis, a geologist; Sam, a mechanic; and me. Our job was to monitor the ice and the marine life beneath it, studying how climate change was affecting the Arctic ecosystem. It was tedious work, collecting samples, analyzing data, and logging our findings, but I didn't mind. The isolation was comforting, in a strange way. At least it was at first. The first strange thing happened about 2 weeks into my stay. I was out on the ice with Luis, drilling a hole to lower a camera into the water below. The temperature was well below freezing, and the wind cut through my jacket like a knife. "Anything?" Luis asked, leaning over my shoulder as I adjusted the camera's focus. "Not yet," I said, squinting at the monitor. The camera's light pierced the darkness beneath the ice, illuminating patches of algae and the occasional fish swimming lazily by. And then I saw it. A shadow. It moved quickly, darting past the camera before I could get a good look at it. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Probably just a seal," Luis said, though he didn't sound convinced. But I knew it wasn't a seal. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the shadow. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard it, a faint tapping sound, like something knocking against the walls of the station. I sat up, my chest tightening. The sound was coming from outside. I got up, pulling on my coat and boots, and stepped out into the freezing night. The station was eerily quiet. The only sound the howling wind and the crunch of snow beneath my feet. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I walked toward the edge of the ice, where the tapping had seemed to come from, and stopped. There were marks on the ice, long, jagged scratches, like something had been clawing at it. I turned back toward the station, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I heard it. A soft, melodic humming, drifting up from the hole we drilled earlier that day. I froze, my breath visible in the cold air. The humming was faint, almost drowned out by the wind, but it was there, a haunting melody that sent a shiver down my spine. I stepped closer to the hole, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The humming stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, something moved beneath the ice. It was just a shadow at first, barely visible in the dim light. But as it got closer, I saw it. A pale, human-like face pressed against the underside of the ice. Its eyes were wide and bright, and its lips curled into a smile that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The face disappeared, and the ice was still again. I ran back to the station, my chest tight with fear. When I told the others what I'd seen, they didn't believe me. "It's probably just a trick of the light," Dr. Hansen said, his tone dismissive. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it wasn't human. Over the next few days, the humming got louder. I heard it at night, drifting through the walls of the station, and during the day, coming from the holes we drilled in the ice. The others started noticing it too. "Probably just the wind," Marina said one evening as we sat in the common room, trying to convince herself more than me. But the wind didn't hum. One night, I woke to the sound of tapping on my window. I sat up, my chest tightening. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the snow outside. The tapping came again, louder this time. I got up, my hands shaking, and pulled back the curtain. She was there. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her long, dark hair floated around her like seaweed. Her eyes were wide and piercing, locking onto mine with an intensity that made my blood run cold. She pressed her hand against the glass, her webbed fingers leaving a faint frost. "Let me in," she whispered, her voice muffled by the window. I stumbled back, my heart racing. When I looked again, she was gone. The next morning, we found the first body. Sam. He was lying in the snow near the edge of the ice, his skin pale and his eyes frozen open in terror. There were scratches on the ice around him, and his boots were wet, as if he'd been dragged into the water and pulled back out. "What the hell is going on?" Luis muttered, his face pale as Dr. Hansen examined the body. No one had an answer, but I knew it had something to do with her. That night, the humming was deafening. It echoed through the station, rattling the walls and filling my head with its haunting melody. "We need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. "We can't," Dr. Hansen said. "The storm's too strong. We'd never make it back to the mainland." The storm. It had come out of nowhere. A blizzard so fierce it had buried the station in snow and ice. We were trapped. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the common room with Marina and Luis, all of us too afraid to close our eyes. Around midnight, the humming stopped. The silence was worse. Then, we heard it. A faint tapping sound, coming from the door. "Don't open it," I whispered, my voice shaking. But Luis didn't listen. He got up, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were in a trance, and walked to the door. "Luis, no," Marina shouted, grabbing his arm. But it was too late. He opened the door. The wind howled, snow swirling into the room, and she stepped inside. Her eyes locked onto mine, and she smiled. "Come with me," she said, her voice soft and sweet. Luis reached out to her, his expression slack and vacant, and she grabbed his hand. Then they were gone, swallowed by the storm. The next morning, we found Luis's body on the ice, his face frozen in the same expression of terror as Sam's. Marina and I didn't wait. We packed what we could and braved the storm, leaving the station behind. I don't know how we made it back to the mainland, but we did. I haven't been back to the Arctic since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the humming again, and I wonder if she's still waiting beneath the ice. If I had listened to the villagers, I wouldn't have gone near the lagoon. I'd grown up in a small village on the coast of a beautiful Caribbean island. It was the kind of place tourists dream about: white sandy beaches, turquoise water, and palm trees swaying in the breeze. But there were places even the tourists didn't go, and the lagoon was one of them. The lagoon was beautiful, hidden deep in the jungle and surrounded by jagged rocks. The water was so clear you could see straight to the bottom, where schools of fish darted between patches of coral. But the villagers always said it was cursed. Stay away from the lagoon. My grandmother would warn me when I was a child. Why? I'd ask, wide-eyed and curious. She'd shake her head, her face pale. There's something in the water, something that doesn't belong. As I got older, I stopped believing in her stories. They seemed like nothing more than old superstitions, passed down from one generation to the next. By the time I was 25, I'd forgotten all about the warnings, until the day I decided to visit the lagoon. It was my day off, and I was looking for a quiet place to escape the heat. The beach was crowded with tourists, so I decided to hike into the jungle, searching for somewhere more secluded. I didn't mean to end up at the lagoon, but as I followed the narrow trail through the trees, I suddenly found myself standing on its rocky shore, staring at the crystal-clear water. It was even more beautiful than I remembered. The surface was so still it looked like glass, reflecting the surrounding jungle in perfect detail. I couldn't resist. The water was cool and refreshing, wrapping around me like a second skin as I waded in. I floated on my back, staring up at the sky, and felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. But then, I heard it, a soft, melodic humming, drifting through the air like a lullaby. I sat up, treading water, and looked around. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the rocks. No answer. The humming grew louder, wrapping around me like a warm breeze. And then, I saw her. At first, I thought she was another swimmer. She was floating near the center of the lagoon. Her long black hair spread out around her like seaweed. "Hello," I called out, waving. She didn't respond. I swam closer, my curiosity outweighing my unease. As I got closer, I realized something was wrong. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were too wide, too bright, like they were reflecting the sunlight even though she was in the shade. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. She turned to look at me, and my stomach twisted. Her smile was too wide, her teeth sharp and jagged like a row of broken glass. I screamed and swam back to the shore as fast as I could, my chest tight with fear. When I looked back, she was gone. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen. Who would believe me? They'd say it was just my imagination, that I'd been out in the sun too long. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it wasn't human. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the lagoon. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, the pale skin, the wide, unblinking eyes, the sharp, jagged teeth. I told myself I wouldn't go back, that it wasn't safe. But something about the lagoon kept pulling me back. One night, I woke to the sound of humming. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I sat up in bed, I realized it was coming from outside. I got up, my heart pounding, and looked out the window. The jungle was dark and still, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon. But the humming was louder now, more insistent, like it was calling to me. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, my chest tight with unease. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The humming stopped, and then I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the lagoon, her pale skin glowing faintly in the moonlight. Her long black hair clung to her shoulders, dripping with water, and her bright eyes locked onto mine. "Come closer," she whispered, her voice soft and melodic. I stumbled back, my hands shaking. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Her smile widened, revealing her sharp teeth. "You," she said. I ran back to the village, my heart pounding in my chest. When I told my grandmother what I'd seen, her face went pale. "You went to the lagoon, didn't you?" she said, her voice trembling. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "She's marked you now," she said. "She won't stop until she gets what she wants." "What do I do?" I asked, my voice shaking. "There's nothing you can do," she said, her eyes filled with sorrow. "She's been here for centuries, taking anyone foolish enough to go into her water. She's part of the island now." That night, I heard the humming again. It was louder this time, echoing through the village like a song carried on the wind. I stayed inside, locking the doors and windows, but it didn't help. I felt her watching me, felt her presence just outside the house. "Come closer," she whispered, her voice drifting through the cracks in the walls. I covered my ears, tears streaming down my face, but her voice was inside my head now, wrapping around me like a vine. The next morning, I left the village. I didn't say goodbye to anyone, didn't tell them where I was going. I just packed my things and walked away, leaving the lagoon and everything else behind. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the humming again, and I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for me to come back. We should have left as soon as we found the footprints. It was supposed to be a romantic weekend, just me and Dylan, staying in a little cottage by the coast. The kind of place you see on postcards. Waves crashing against the rocks, seagulls crying overhead, and a cold breeze that smelled like salt and freedom. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks. Dylan had rented the cottage for my birthday, saying it would be a chance for us to unplug and spend time together without distractions. And at first, it was perfect. Until the third day. That's when we found the footprints. It had been raining all morning, and the wind was so strong it rattled the windows of the cottage. "We'll have to stay inside today," Dylan said, sipping his coffee as he stared out at the gray horizon. "I don't mind," I said, pulling a blanket over my shoulders. But by the afternoon, the rain had stopped, and the sun was peeking out from behind the clouds. "Let's go for a walk," Dylan said, grabbing his jacket. "The beach will be amazing after the storm." He was right. The storm had churned up the ocean, leaving the beach littered with seaweed, shells, and bits of driftwood. We spent the first hour wandering along the shoreline, picking up pieces of sea glass and watching the waves crash against the rocks. That's when we saw them. The footprints were strange. At first, I thought they belonged to some kind of animal. They were small and oddly shaped, almost like webbed toes pressed into the wet sand. "Maybe it's a seal," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Dylan crouched down, running his fingers over the marks. "Seals don't have feet," he said, frowning. The prints led from the water's edge to a cluster of rocks further up the beach, where they disappeared. "I bet it's just some weird bird," Dylan said, standing up and brushing the sand off his hands. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. That night, I couldn't sleep. The cottage was quiet, the only sound the distant crash of waves against the shore. I kept thinking about the footprints, the way they seemed to come from nowhere and vanish just as suddenly. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of tapping. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of the wind, but it was there, soft and rhythmic, like someone knocking on the window. I sat up, my chest tightening. "Dylan," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He muttered, half asleep. "Do you hear that?" He frowned, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" The tapping stopped. "Never mind," I said, lying back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was outside, watching us. The next morning, we decided to explore the rocks where the footprints had disappeared. The tide was low, revealing a maze of jagged boulders and tide pools filled with sea urchins and crabs. "This is incredible," Dylan said, his voice echoing off the rocks. I followed him cautiously, my boots slipping on the wet stone. The further we went, the more uneasy I felt. The air seemed colder here, the wind sharper, and the waves louder, as if the ocean was trying to warn us. And then, we found it. The cave was hidden behind a cluster of rocks, its entrance barely visible from the beach. "Let's check it out," Dylan said, grinning. "Do we have to?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Come on," he said, grabbing my hand. "It'll be fun." The cave was dark and narrow, the walls slick with moisture. The sound of the waves echoed through the passage, growing louder as we went deeper. "Look," Dylan said, pointing at the ground. "More footprints." They were identical to the ones we'd seen on the beach, but these were deeper, pressed into the soft sand at the back of the cave. "Okay, this is creepy," I said, backing toward the entrance. Dylan didn't respond. He was staring at something on the wall. "Is that writing?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to look and felt my stomach drop. The marks on the wall weren't writing. Not exactly. They looked like scratches, long and jagged, carved into the stone by something sharp. But they weren't random. The lines formed strange, intricate patterns that made my head ache just looking at them. "What do you think it means?" Dylan asked, running his fingers over the carvings. "Let's just go," I said, grabbing his arm. But before we could leave, we heard it. A soft, melodic humming, drifting through the cave. We froze, our eyes locking in the dim light. "What was that?" I whispered, my chest tightening. Dylan shook his head, his face pale. The humming grew louder, echoing off the walls and filling the cave with its haunting melody. "Let's get out of here," I said, pulling him toward the entrance. But before we could move, something stepped out of the shadows. She was beautiful, in the most unsettling way. Her skin was pale and wet, shimmering faintly in the dim light. Her long, dark hair clung to her shoulders, and her bright, unblinking eyes locked onto ours with an intensity that made my blood run cold. She smiled, her lips parting to reveal sharp, jagged teeth. Who are you?" Dylan asked, his voice trembling. She didn't answer. She just stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. "Let's go," I whispered, tugging at his arm, but he didn't move. "Dylan, come on," I shouted, my voice breaking. He turned to me, his eyes wide and empty. "She's beautiful," he whispered. I screamed as he stepped toward her, his movements slow and mechanical, like he was in a trance. The woman reached out, her webbed fingers curling around his wrist, and pulled him toward the water at the back of the cave. "Dylan!" I shouted, running after him, but it was too late. The last thing I saw was her face, smiling up at me from the dark water as she dragged him under. I ran out of the cave, tears streaming down my face, and didn't stop until I reached the cottage. I called the police, but they didn't believe me. They said Dylan must have fallen into the water and drowned, that the cave was dangerous during high tide. But I knew the truth. I knew she'd taken him. I left the cottage the next day and never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the humming again, and I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for someone else to follow her into the cave. The Titapool wasn't supposed to be dangerous. It had always been my favorite place on the island. I'd spend hours there as a kid, searching for crabs and starfish and bits of sea glass. Even now, at 16, I still went there whenever I needed to clear my head. The island was small, just a few hundred people living in scattered villages along the coast. There wasn't much to do, so the Titapool became my escape. It was tucked away at the edge of a rocky beach, hidden from the rest of the world by jagged cliffs and twisting trails. I never thought it would hurt me, but that was before Max disappeared. Max was my dog, a scruffy little mutt with floppy ears and a wagging tail. He followed me everywhere, his paws clicking on the rocks as he darted around the Titapool, sniffing at seaweed and chasing the occasional crab. The day he disappeared was overcast, the sky a dull gray and the air heavy with the smell of salt. I'd been sitting on the edge of the Titapool, dangling my feet in the water while Max sniffed at something a few feet away. I wasn't paying attention when it happened. One moment, he was there, his tail wagging as he barked at something in the water. The next, he was gone. "Max?" I called, standing up and looking around. The Titapool was calm, the water still and clear. "Max!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the cliffs. There was no sign of him. No barking, no splashing, nothing. My chest tightened as I waded into the Titapool, the cold water lapping at my legs. "Max, come on," I called, my voice trembling. I reached the spot where he'd been standing and stopped. The sand at the bottom of the Titapool was disturbed, as if something had been dragged into the deeper part of the water. And there was something else, something shiny. I reached down, my fingers brushing against a smooth, cold object buried in the sand. It was Max's collar. The leather was torn, the metal buckle scratched and bent. My stomach twisted as I stared at it, my hands shaking. What the hell? I whispered to myself. The Titapool was shallow, no more than 3 feet deep at its deepest point. There was no way he could have just vanished, but he was gone, and something told me he wasn't coming back. That night, I told my mom what had happened. She frowned, her hands stilling on the dish she was washing. "He probably ran off," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "No, Mom," I said, my voice rising. I was right there. He didn't run off. Something happened to him. "Like what?" she asked, turning to face me. "I don't know," I said, tears welling up in my eyes. But it wasn't normal. She sighed, wiping her hands on a towel. "Look, honey, I know you're upset, but Max is a dog. Sometimes dogs wander off. He'll come back." But I knew she was wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment Max disappeared over and over in my head. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft, melodic humming, drifting through the air like a lullaby. I sat up, my chest tightening. The sound was faint, almost drowned out by the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. But it was there. I got up, grabbing a flashlight, and stepped outside. The island was quiet, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon. But the humming was louder now, coming from the direction of the tide pool. I made my way down the trail, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The tide pool glimmered in the moonlight, its surface calm and still. But something was wrong. The water seemed darker than usual, almost black, and there were ripples spreading across the surface, even though there was no wind. And then I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the tide pool, her long black hair clinging to her pale skin. Her back was to me, but I could see her hands, webbed and clawed, reaching down into the water. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. She turned to look at me, and my stomach dropped. Her eyes were too wide, too bright, and her lips curled into a smile that revealed rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "Come closer," she whispered, her voice soft and melodic. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. What are you?" I whispered. She tilted her head, her smile widening. "Come closer," she said again. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back at the house, my chest tight and my legs trembling. The next morning, I went back to the tide pool with my mom. "It was right here," I said, pointing at the spot where I'd seen her. The tide pool was calm and clear, the water sparkling in the sunlight. There was no sign of her, no sign of Max. My mom sighed, shaking her head. "You've been under a lot of stress," she said. "Maybe you just imagined it." But I knew what I'd seen. Over the next few days, I started to notice other things. The tide pool was different now. The water seemed darker, the air colder, and sometimes, late at night, I'd hear the humming again, drifting through the window like a ghostly song. I stayed away, too afraid to go back. But then, other animals started disappearing. First, it was a stray cat that hung around the village. Then it was one of the neighbors' goats. The villagers began whispering about the tide pool, their faces pale with fear. "She's awake," one of the elders said, her voice trembling. "And she's hungry." I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew she was right. One night, I woke to the sound of scratching at the window. I sat up, my chest tightening, and looked outside. She was there, her wide, piercing eyes locked onto mine, her sharp teeth glinting in the moonlight. "Come closer," she whispered, her voice like a song. I stumbled back, my hands shaking. "Leave me alone," I shouted. Her smile widened, and she pressed her hand against the glass, leaving a faint, wet mark. "Come closer," she said again, and then she was gone. The next morning, I packed my things and left the island. I haven't been back since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the humming again, and I wonder if she's still waiting for me by the tide pool, ready to take someone else. There's a reason the locals never go near the shipwreck. I didn't believe them at first. I'd read about the wreck online. A 19th century merchant ship that had run aground during a storm, leaving its remains scattered across the reef. Treasure hunters had speculated for years that the wreck might still hold valuables, gold coins, jewelry, or even artifacts from the ship's cargo. When my buddy Mark suggested we dive there, I didn't think twice. "We'll be the first ones to explore it in years," he said, his voice filled with excitement. Who knows what we'll find? It was supposed to be a simple dive, but what we found there changed everything. The locals tried to warn us. When we mentioned the shipwreck to the guy who rented us our gear, his face went pale. "You shouldn't go out there," he said, shaking his head. "Why not?" Mark asked, frowning. "There's something in the water," the man said. "Something that doesn't want to be found." Mark laughed. "Come on, man. You don't believe in those old legends, do you?" The man didn't laugh. "If you're smart," he said, his voice low, "you'll stay away." But we didn't. We set out early the next morning, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon. The boat ride to the wreck was smooth, the water calm and glassy. From a distance, the reef looked beautiful, a cluster of jagged rocks jutting out of the water, their surfaces covered in barnacles and seaweed. But as we got closer, the mood shifted. The air felt heavier, the water darker. Even Mark, who was usually fearless, seemed uneasy. "You ready?" he asked as he strapped on his gear, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Yeah," I said, though my hands were shaking. We slipped into the water, the coolness wrapping around us like a blanket, and began our descent. The wreck was stunning. The remains of the ship were scattered across the reef, its wooden beams covered in coral and its rusted metal fittings glinting faintly in the filtered sunlight. We swam through the wreckage, our flashlights cutting through the murky water as we searched for anything valuable. "Over here," Mark called, his voice muffled through his diving mask. I swam toward him, my heart racing with excitement. He'd found an old chest, half buried in the sand. We worked together to pry it open, revealing its contents: coins, jewelry, and what looked like a carved ivory figurine. "Jackpot," Mark said, grinning. But as we celebrated, I felt it. A presence. Something watching us. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The water was cold and dark, and the wreck had an eerie stillness to it that made my skin crawl. But then I saw it. A shadow, moving just beyond the edge of the wreck. It was quick, almost too quick to see, but it was there. A long, sinuous shape that darted through the water like a predator circling its prey. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "See what?" Mark asked, frowning. I pointed toward the shadow, but it was gone. "Probably just a fish," Mark said, shrugging. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a fish. As we continued searching the wreck, the presence grew stronger. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my chest tightening every time I thought I saw movement in the water. "Let's head back," I said finally, my voice shaking. Mark frowned. "We just got here," he said. "I don't care," I said, grabbing his arm. "Something's not right." Before he could argue, I heard it, a soft, melodic humming, drifting through the water like a song. The sound was haunting, wrapping around me like a physical force. Mark froze, his eyes wide as he listened. "What is that?" he whispered. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and I felt a strange pull, like the water itself was trying to drag me toward its source. "Let's go," I said, grabbing Mark's arm, but he didn't move. "Mark, come on," I shouted, my voice muffled through my mask. He turned to look at me, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "What?" I asked, my chest tightening. He pointed toward the edge of the wreck, and I followed his gaze. That's when I saw her. She was floating just beyond the wreck, her long black hair swirling around her like a dark halo. Her skin was pale and shimmering, her eyes wide and bright. At first, I thought she was a diver, maybe someone from another boat, but as she swam closer, I realized something was wrong. Her movements were too smooth, too quick, like she wasn't moving through the water but commanding it. And her eyes, they were too large, too reflective, like mirrors that showed only darkness. "Come closer," she said, her voice soft and melodic. Mark began swimming toward her, his movements slow and mechanical, like he was in a trance. "Mark, no," I shouted, grabbing his arm. He shook me off, his eyes locked onto hers. "She wants to show us something," he said, his voice distant. I watched in horror as he swam toward her, his figure disappearing into the darkness. And then, she turned to look at me. Her smile was wide and unnatural, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that made my blood run cold. "Come closer," she said, her voice wrapping around me like a siren's call. I wanted to run, to swim as far away as I could, but my body wouldn't move. She reached out, her webbed fingers curling toward me. "Come closer," she said again, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark water. I don't know how I managed to break free. Somehow, I forced myself to turn and swim back to the surface, my lungs burning as I kicked against the water. By the time I reached the boat, I was shaking so badly I could barely pull myself aboard. Mark never came back. The Coast Guard searched for him for days, but there was no sign of him. The official report said he must have gotten lost in the wreck and drowned. But I know the truth. I know she took him. I haven't been back in the water since. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the humming again. And I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for someone else to come too close to the wreck. I knew something was wrong with her the moment she walked in. It was late, almost closing time, and the bar was mostly empty. A couple of fishermen sat at one table, laughing over their beers, and a group of college kids were by the jukebox, arguing about what song to play next. I was behind the counter, wiping down glasses and counting the minutes until I could go home. Then she walked in. She wasn't like the usual crowd we got at the Seaglass Tavern. Most of our customers were locals, fishermen, dock workers, and tourists in flip-flops looking for a quick drink. But she was different. She moved with this strange, graceful confidence, like she owned the place. Her long, dark hair clung to her shoulders, damp and shining in the dim light, and her pale blue eyes seemed to take in everything at once. She didn't look like she belonged here. "Evening," I said, forcing a smile as she approached the bar. She didn't respond, just tilted her head and stared at me with those piercing eyes. "What can I get you?" I asked, trying to ignore the shiver that ran down my spine. "Something cold," she said finally, her voice soft and melodic. I nodded, grabbing a bottle of beer from the cooler and popping the cap off. She didn't touch it right away. Instead, she ran her fingers along the edge of the bar, her nails long and sharp, like they hadn't been trimmed in weeks. "You work here alone?" she asked, her eyes locking onto mine. "No," I lied. "The owner's in the back." She smiled, and for a moment, I thought I saw something sharp glinting behind her lips. The fishermen got up to leave a few minutes later, waving good night as they stumbled out the door. The college kids followed soon after, leaving me alone with her. She still hadn't touched her drink. "Not a beer fan?" I asked, trying to make conversation. She tilted her head again, her smile widening. It's not what I'm thirsty for. I laughed nervously, trying to ignore the way her gaze seemed to pierce right through me. Well, let me know if you change your mind, I said, turning to wipe down the counter. That's when I noticed it. The floor beneath her stool was wet. At first, I thought she'd spilled something, but when I looked closer, I saw it wasn't just a small puddle. Water was dripping from her. Her hair, her clothes, even her hands. Are you okay? I asked, my voice trembling. She smiled again, her teeth sharp and jagged like broken glass. Do you believe in fate? She asked, her voice soft and melodic. What? I asked, taking a step back. She leaned closer, her wet fingers brushing against mine. Do you believe in destiny? I tried to pull away, but her grip tightened, her nails digging into my skin. I think you were meant to meet me tonight, she said, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I yanked my hand away, my heart racing. Look, lady, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't know what your deal is, but you need to leave. She laughed, the sound low and haunting. You can't send me away, she said, standing up. Her movements were unnaturally smooth, almost like she was floating. I backed away, my chest tightening as the puddle beneath her grew larger, spreading across the floor like a tide. Leave, I said again, my voice trembling. Her smile faded, and her eyes darkened. You don't understand, she said, her voice sharp and cold. You don't have a choice. The lights flickered, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, the air was filled with the sound of rushing water, loud and deafening like a storm surging through the room. I stumbled back, slipping on the wet floor as the water rose around me, soaking my shoes and creeping up my legs. She stepped closer, her feet barely touching the ground, her wide, unblinking eyes locked onto mine. Come with me, she whispered, her voice wrapping around me like a warm blanket. No, I said, my voice shaking. She tilted her head, her sharp teeth glinting in the flickering light. You can't say no, she said. The door to the bar burst open, and the storm outside roared in, sending chairs and tables crashing to the floor. The water was up to my knees now, cold and biting, and I could feel the pull of the tide dragging me toward her. Please, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Leave me alone. She smiled, her wet fingers reaching out to touch my cheek. You belong to me now, she said. I don't remember what happened next. The last thing I saw was her face, inches from mine, her glowing eyes filling my vision. When I woke up, the bar was empty. The water was gone, and the only sign that she'd been there was the faint, damp outline of her footprints leading to the door. I quit my job the next day. The owner said the storm must have rattled me, that I'd probably imagined the whole thing. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, late at night, I still feel the cold touch of her fingers on my skin, and I wonder if she's waiting for me to come back.